23 hyenas formed a living wall around her. Kaylee stood motionless in the center of the circle, her golden fur caked with dust from weeks without rain, her ribs visible beneath skin stretched too tight over muscle and bone. In her mouth, held with the desperate gentleness that only a mother understands, hung her cub. 2 months old, 4 pounds of life that represented everything she had left in this world. The hyenas did not rush. They never did. When they knew their prey had nowhere to go, they moved in slow, deliberate steps, tightening the circle inch by inch, their spotted bodies forming an unbroken ring of teeth and hunger. Their calls filled the air, that terrible laughing sound that echoed across the scorched savannah, like a promise of what was coming. Each voice joined the chorus until the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding Kaylee the way their bodies surrounded her. 15 meters away, Daniel Mercer sat frozen behind the wheel of his Land Rover. His camera hung useless around his neck. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had turned white. Through the dusty windshield, he watched the scene unfold with the helpless clarity of a man who had been trained never to interfere, never to choose sides, never to become part of the story he was documenting. His throat was dry. His heart was pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. But this was not a story. This was an execution. The hyenas took another step inward. The circle tightened. Kaylee turned slowly, searching for a gap that did not exist, her amber eyes scanning the wall of predators surrounding her. She was outnumbered, outflanked, out of options, and she knew it. Daniel could see it in the way she held herself, the slight tremor in her legs that spoke of exhaustion pushed past its limits. What happened next would stay with Daniel Mercer for the rest of his life. The lioness looked directly at him, not through him, not past him, at him. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. In that moment, something passed between them, something that Daniel would never be able to explain to anyone who was not there. A recognition, a question, a desperate, impossible hope, and then she ran. Not away from the hyenas, toward the vehicle, toward him. The hyenas hesitated. They feared the machine, the metal beast that smelled of fuel and made sounds they could not understand. That hesitation gave Kaylee the seconds she needed. Her powerful legs carried her across the distance in heartbeats, the dust rising behind her paws like smoke. She reached the Land Rover and stopped at the driver's side door. Daniel could see her chest heaving, could hear the ragged desperation of her breathing through the open window. She was close enough that he could count the scars on her muzzle, close enough that he could see the dried blood on her paws from days of walking on cracked earth, close enough that he could smell the wildness on her, the dust and sweat and something else, something that smelled like fear. And then she did something impossible. She rose up on her hind legs, placed her front paws on the door frame, and lifted her head toward Daniel. In her mouth, the cub hung limp and silent, his small body swaying gently with her movement. She pushed forward, extending her neck through the open window, bringing the cub closer and closer to him until there was nowhere else for it to go except into his hands. Daniel did not think. He could not think. His arms moved on their own, reaching out, and he felt the warm weight of the cub settle into his palms as Kaylee released her grip. The transfer was gentle, almost tender, the way a mother passes her newborn to a trusted friend. For one eternal second, their eyes met. Hers were not wild. They were not desperate. They were clear and certain, the eyes of a mother who had made her choice and would not regret it regardless of what came next. Then she dropped back to the ground, turned toward the circle of hyenas, and walked away from her child. If you have ever felt your heart break for an animal you have never met, if you have ever believed that the bond between mother and child transcends every boundary nature has built, then you understand why stories like this need to be told. Please take a moment to subscribe and join our community. Every new member helps us share more of these incredible connections that remind us what love truly means. 3 weeks earlier, the Serengeti had been a different world. The rains had failed for the second consecutive year. Rivers that had flowed for generations now lay as cracked scars across the landscape, their beds baked into patterns that looked like the skin of ancient reptiles. Watering holes that once drew hundreds of animals had shrunk to muddy pools where the desperate gathered, and the weak died waiting for their turn to drink. The grass that should have been green and tall by this time of year was brown and brittle, breaking under every footstep like tiny bones. Kaylee had been the matriarch of a pride of 9. Her territory stretched across 12 square miles of prime hunting ground near the Mara River, land that her mother had claimed and her grandmother before that. 3 generations of lionesses had been born and raised on this soil. She had ruled with the quiet confidence of a lioness who had never known true hunger, who had never faced a threat she could not overcome with the strength of her family beside her. Her mate, a massive male named Zeru, had been with her for 4 years. His mane was dark and full, a sign of health and strength that made other males think twice before challenging him. Her 2 adult daughters hunted beside her, learning the patience and precision that would one day make them leaders of their own groups. Her sister shared the duties of raising the young. It was a good pride, a strong pride, the kind of family that other lions avoided and hyenas feared to challenge. The drought changed everything. When the herds began their desperate migration toward the last remaining water sources in the north, Kali made the decision to follow. It was the right choice, the only choice, but it took them through territory claimed by a coalition of 3 young males who had been watching the weakened prides with hungry eyes. These were lions in their prime, brothers who had been pushed out of their birth pride and had spent 2 years building their strength, waiting for exactly this opportunity. The attack came at the worst possible moment, when the pride was crossing a riverbed that had become a maze of dried mud and loose stones. Zeru fought like the king he was, his roars echoing across the empty channel, buying time for his family to escape. But 3 against 1 are odds that no lion can survive, no matter how strong, no matter how brave. Kali heard his final roar from half a mile away, a sound of defiance that cut off suddenly and left only silence. That sound, that terrible silence, still echoed in her dreams. Her daughters tried to stand with her. She ordered them to run, snarling at them with a ferocity she had never shown her own children. They did not listen. They were their mother's daughters, brave and stubborn, and they died being both. Kaylee did not see it happen. She heard it, and that was worse. Kaylee fled with her sister and the 4 cubs she had given birth to just 6 weeks earlier. They ran through the night and into the next day, putting miles between themselves and the territory that had become a graveyard. Her sister collapsed from exhaustion on the 2nd evening, her body simply giving out after days, without food and a lifetime of loyalty. Kali waited with her until the end, pressed against her side, listening to her breathing grow slower and slower until it stopped. Then she gathered her cubs and continued alone. The weeks that followed were a lesson in how much a mother can endure. Without a pride to help her hunt, Kaylee was forced to leave her cubs hidden in whatever shelter she could find while she searched for food. Small prey mostly, hares when she could catch them, a young gazelle that had been separated from its herd. Once a monitor lizard that hissed and fought until her jaws finally closed around its neck. Never enough. Never nearly enough to produce the milk her cubs needed, never enough to rebuild the strength her own body was burning through day after day. The first cub died on the 8th day. She found him in the morning, still warm, curled against his siblings, as if he had simply fallen asleep and forgotten to wake up. His small body had simply been too weak to keep going. She carried him for hours, before accepting what she already knew, before finding a place beneath an acacia tree where the soil was soft enough to bury what remained. The 2nd and 3rd died together during a night when the temperature dropped and Kaylee could not keep all of them warm with just her body. She woke to find them pressed against her side, peaceful and cold, their small faces relaxed in a way that they had never been in life. No more hunger, no more fear, just stillness. That left only Tao, the smallest of the litter, the one the others had pushed aside during feeding, the one she had worried about from the moment he was born, certain he would be the first to fade. But Tao had something his siblings lacked. A stubbornness, a refusal to surrender that burned in his amber eyes every time he latched onto her and drank with a determination that seemed to say, "I'm not finished yet." He became everything. Her reason to keep walking when her paws cracked and bled. Her reason to keep hunting when her body screamed for rest. Her reason to keep living when every part of her wanted to lie down beside her lost children and let the savannah take her too. She would not let the drought have him. She would not let the hunger have him. She would find a way, any way, to give him the chance to grow into the lion he was meant to become. 2 weeks before she would stand at Daniel Mercer's door with her son in her mouth, Kaylee saw the human for the first time. She had been stalking a group of Thompson's gazelles near a cluster of acacia trees when she noticed the vehicle parked on a low ridge overlooking the plain. Inside sat a man with grey in his hair and something around his neck that caught the sunlight. He was pointing it at the gazelles, making soft clicking sounds that carried faintly on the wind. Kali abandoned her hunt and watched him instead. He stayed for 3 hours. He did not leave the vehicle. He did not approach the animals. He simply sat and watched and made his clicking sounds, and when the gazelles eventually moved on, he let them go without following. This was not hunter behavior. This was something else. Over the following days, Kaylee encountered him again and again. He seemed to appear wherever the animals gathered, always keeping his distance, always staying in his metal shell. She watched him share his water with a limping zebra that approached his vehicle, pouring liquid into his hand and letting the animal drink. She watched him sit perfectly still while a herd of elephants passed within feet of his door, their massive bodies blocking out the sun. She watched him lower his clicking device and simply look at the sunset one evening, staying until the stars emerged before finally driving away. He was not a threat. He was something she had no word for. Something that observed without taking. Something that existed in her world without trying to consume it. She filed him away in her memory, the way she filed away the locations of water sources and the territories of rival predators. Information that might matter someday, a variable in the endless calculation of survival. She had no way of knowing how soon that day would come. Daniel Mercer had spent 22 years photographing war. He had documented conflicts on 4 continents. He had captured images that appeared on the covers of magazines and haunted the nightmares of people who saw them. He had won awards for photographs he wished he had never taken, stood beside mass graves and child soldiers and weeping mothers holding bodies too small for the violence that had ended them. His camera had been his shield, the lens a barrier between himself and horrors that would have destroyed him if he had let them in. The breaking point came in a refugee camp in South Sudan. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, had approached him while he was changing the memory card in his camera. She was carrying a plastic jug that had once held cooking oil, walking toward a water distribution point that was still 3 hours from opening. Her feet were bare, and her dress was torn, and her eyes were too old for her face. She stopped in front of him, looked at his camera, and asked a question in a language he did not speak. He understood it anyway. Everyone always asked the same thing. Why are you taking pictures instead of helping? He did not have an answer. He had never had an answer. He had always told himself that the photographs were helping, that showing the world what was happening would make a difference, that his job was to document truth and let others act on it. The camera was his purpose. The images were his contribution. That was what he told himself every night when he could not sleep. But standing in that camp, looking into the eyes of a child who was asking him to be more than a witness, Daniel Mercer realized he did not believe it anymore. He put down his camera. He picked up the water jug. He waited with her for 3 hours and then carried the full container back to her family's tent. She smiled at him, the first real smile he had seen in months, and it broke something inside him that had been cracked for years. That night, he booked a flight to Tanzania. He told himself he was coming to photograph something beautiful for a change. Life instead of death. Survival instead of suffering. He wanted to fill his camera with images that would remind him why the world was worth saving, why beauty still existed alongside all the horror he had witnessed. The drought was waiting for him. 3 months into his time in the Serengeti, Daniel had documented 17 animal deaths. Lions, zebras, a baby elephant that collapsed 50 feet from a watering hole and never rose again. He had photographs of vultures and photographs of bones and photographs of eyes going glassy in the African sun. The beauty he had come to find was buried beneath the same suffering he had tried to escape. He was beginning to wonder if death followed him wherever he went. And now he sat in his Land Rover with a lion cub clutched against his chest, watching a mother walk toward her own destruction. And every instinct he had was screaming at him to do something other than watch. The hyenas had recovered from their confusion. Kali stood 30 feet from the vehicle now, positioned between the predators and her child. She was not running. She was not fighting. She was simply standing there, making herself the only target, giving Daniel time to escape with Tao. Her ears were flat against her head. Her tail hung low. Every line of her body spoke of exhaustion and acceptance. She was offering herself. The hyenas began to close in again. Their calls had changed, lower now, more purposeful. They could see she was alone. They could see she was exhausted. They could count as well as any predator. And the math was simple, 23-1. Daniel watched the circle tighten. He watched Kaylee turn slowly, tracking the threats on all sides. Her body tense, but her movements deliberate. She was not panicking. She was calculating, buying seconds, buying minutes, buying whatever time she could for the cub that was now trembling against Daniel's shirt, making small sounds that might have been fear, or might have been hunger, or might have been a call for a mother who could not answer. A hyena took a step forward, testing. Kali spun to face it, and a sound came from her throat, low and dangerous. The hyena retreated, but 2 more had advanced while her back was turned. The circle was smaller now, 10 feet of space where there had been 15. Daniel's hand moved to the ignition. He knew the rules. He had signed documents promising to follow them. No intervention, no interference. Nature must be allowed to take its course. These were not suggestions. They were the fundamental principles of wildlife documentation, built on decades of hard-learned lessons about what happens when humans decide they know better than the forces that shape the world. But the rules had been written by people who had never sat 15 meters from a mother sacrificing herself for her child. His fingers touched the key, cold metal against sweating skin. Kaylee looked back at him, just for a moment, just long enough for their eyes to meet one final time across the space between them. He could not read her expression, could not pretend to understand what passed behind those amber eyes, but he knew what he saw. Permission, request. The acknowledgement of one living thing to another that what he did next was his choice and his alone. Daniel turned the key. The engine roared to life. The sound cut through the hyena calls like a blade. Every spotted head turned toward the vehicle, ears flattening, bodies tensing with the instinctive fear of something they could not fight and could not eat. Daniel pressed the accelerator, and the Land Rover lurched forward, tires spinning briefly on the dry earth before catching. He did not drive at the hyenas. He drove past them, giving Kaylee a path, an escape route that had not existed seconds before. The horn blared, a sound so foreign to this ancient landscape that even the boldest predators scrambled backward. Daniel kept moving, kept making noise, kept disrupting the careful choreography of the hunt. Kylie understood immediately. She ran. Not away from Daniel, but alongside him, matching the speed of the vehicle as it carved through the scattered hyenas. Her legs stretched and contracted in the effortless rhythm that her species had perfected over millions of years, and even exhausted, even starving, she was faster than anything the drought had left alive on these plains. Dust rose behind her paws. Her muscles worked beneath her skin like water flowing over stones. The hyenas pursued. Of course they did. They had invested too much time, traveled too far to surrender their prey so easily. But they were built for endurance, not speed, and the Land Rover was something their evolution had never prepared them to chase. One by one, they began to fall back, their bodies recognizing what their instincts refused to accept. Daniel drove for nearly a mile before he dared to check his mirrors. The hyenas had fallen back. Most had already stopped, standing in frustrated clusters on the brown grass, their calls fading into the distance. A few stubborn ones were still running, but their pace was slowing, their tongues hanging, their bodies finally admitting defeat. He slowed the vehicle. Kaylee slowed beside him. For a long moment, they simply moved together through the savannah, the lioness and the machine, the mother and the man who had chosen to become more than a witness. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could feel the cub shifting against his chest, still alive, still warm, still fighting. He stopped the Land Rover at the base of a small kopje, a rocky outcropping that would provide shade and a view of approaching threats. Kylie stopped too, her sides heaving, her tongue hanging from her mouth as she fought to catch her breath. Daniel opened his door. He did not know if this was the right thing to do. He did not know if Kaylee would attack him the moment he stepped outside, her instincts overriding whatever strange truce they had formed. He did not know anything except that he was holding her child, and she was standing 10 feet away, waiting to have him back. He stepped out of the vehicle. His boots crunched on the dry grass. Kaylee did not move. She watched him with those amber eyes, her body still except for the rise and fall of her breathing. Daniel walked toward her slowly, one careful step at a time, holding Tao in front of him so she could see that her son was unharmed. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to touch, close enough to die if she decided that was what should happen next. He knelt down, he extended his arms, and he waited. Kaylee approached. Her movements were slow and deliberate, each paw placement precise, her eyes never leaving the cub in his hands. She stopped inches from Daniel, so close that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the dust and exhaustion on her fur. She lowered her head and sniffed Tao. The cub made a small sound, a recognition, and began to squirm toward his mother with renewed energy. Daniel released his grip, and Kaylee took her son gently in her mouth, lifting him as carefully as she had placed him in human hands just minutes before. She could have left then. She could have turned and disappeared into the savannah without looking back, and Daniel would have understood. He had served his purpose. The transaction was complete. But she did not leave. Instead, Kaylee stepped forward. She pressed her forehead against Daniel's shoulder and held it there. 3 seconds, maybe 4. An eternity measured in heartbeats and the soft sound of a cub breathing against his mother's chest. Daniel did not move. He barely breathed. He simply existed in that moment of connection, feeling the weight of her trust against his body. Then she pulled away, turned, and walked into the fading afternoon light, her son secure in her grip, her silhouette growing smaller against the orange sky until Daniel could no longer tell where the lioness ended and the savannah began. He sat down in the dirt beside his Land Rover and cried. Daniel stayed in the region for 6 more weeks. He found Kaylee again on the 11th day, drinking from a muddy pool with Tao beside her. She saw the vehicle and did not run. She simply watched as he parked at a respectful distance, raised his camera, and took the photograph he had come to Africa to find. A mother and her child, alive against all odds, standing together in a world that had tried its best to tear them apart. He documented their recovery from a distance, respecting the boundary that existed between his world and hers. He watched Tao grow stronger on the milk his mother somehow kept producing despite her own hunger. He watched Kaylee hunt successfully for the first time in weeks, bringing down a young impala and eating her fill before carrying meat back to her hidden cub. And he watched, 3 weeks later, when Kali encountered a small group of lionesses who had also lost their prides to the drought. There was tension at first, the careful circling and posturing that preceded either violence or acceptance. But hunger and loneliness are powerful motivators, and by the second day, Kali was hunting beside them. The last time Daniel saw her, she was lying in the shade of an acacia tree, with Tao pressed against her side. 2 other cubs, orphans adopted by the new group, were playing nearby. Kaylee's eyes were closed, her breathing slow and peaceful, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked like a lioness who was not fighting for survival. She looked like a mother who had won. Daniel returned to the United States the following month. He published a book of photographs from his time in the Serengeti, but he never included the images from that day. Some moments are too sacred to share with strangers. Some stories belong only to the ones who lived them. He does keep one photograph on his desk, though. It shows a lioness and her cub drinking from a muddy pool, their reflections rippling in the water, the morning sun painting everything gold. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, is the shadow of a Land Rover, a witness who chose to become something more. And now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where every rule told you to stay back, but everything inside you screamed to act? Have you ever watched someone struggle and felt that unbearable tension between what you are supposed to do and what you know is right? I think about Daniel often. I think about the choice he made in that moment. The way he decided that being human meant more than following protocol. He did not save Kaylee because he thought he knew better than nature. He saved her because she asked, because she trusted him, because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is answer when another living being calls for help. If this story moved you, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me about a time when you chose connection over caution. Tell me about an animal that changed the way you see the world. And if you have not already, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with someone who needs to be reminded that trust, even between strangers, even between species, can still exist in this world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring, and thank you for believing that these stories matter. Until next time.